99.5.
WEVF, Colebrook, 90.3.
WEVQ, Littleton, 91.9.
And online at NHPR.org.
From New Hampshire Public Radio, I'm Laura Kanoy, and this is The Exchange. Before the midterm elections in November, there are 3 key state primary races voters will decide in September. And one of them is for New Hampshire Governor. 2 Democrats, Steve Marchand and Molly Kelly, are competing to be their party's nominee to face Republican Governor Chris Sununu. The Exchange has spoken to both Democratic candidates, and you can find those interviews on our website. And we extended an invitation to both candidates to appear together on our show before the primary, so listeners could compare them on the issues. Molly Kelly declined the invitation, so we're sitting down with Steve Marchand for most of the hour. Then we'll hear from NHPR's Josh Rogers, who's been covering the governor's race overall. And let's hear from you. Our email, exchange@nhpr.org. Again, exchange@nhpr.org. Respond on Facebook or Twitter at NHPR Exchange, or give us a call, 1-800-892-6477. Again, that number, 1-800-892-6477. And Mr. Marchand, welcome back to the Exchange. Thanks for being here.
Thank you very much.
So Democrats have a choice to make, so here's your chance. Why should they pick you, Mr. Marchand, over former State Senator Molly Kelly? Give us the short version, please, and then we'll talk about some of the themes that you bring up.
Yeah, and I look forward to the hour. I appreciate the opportunity. Look, this election's bigger than just who gets elected governor, though that's big enough. It really is about what the future of the party, the state, and in our own small way, the country is going to look like. This is a massively chaotic time politically in the country. And this is the moment, like it was after Watergate, the last time it was this messy, when we have to decide how we're going to define the future, lest somebody else, probably in a way we don't like as much, defines it for us. And I think that if we have a candidate that it can both excite the base with progressive policies that are straightforward, data-driven, and can get people excited about what it means to be a Democrat, not just what it means to not be Donald Trump. Not only will you excite the base, you will also attract the very same voters who we call the swing voters. They voted for Romney, then they voted for Clinton. They're not Republicans, but they're not quite Democrats yet. It turns out the things that I and most other progressive Democrats want is actually quite similar to the message and the future for New Hampshire that most of those other voters want. And it means that we can lean forward with the message with clarity, vision, competence, and courage.
So let's say a Democrat listening right now is wondering, okay, Molly Kelly seems pretty good. Steve Marchand seems pretty good. Give that Democrat listening right now the reason to pick you over her. It's a primary.
It is a primary. And so in the big picture of Republican versus Democrat, the differences will seem nuanced in some cases compared to, say,
sure, you're all in the same party. Yeah.
Right? But there are differences, and some of them deal with types of issues. So folks that have followed this campaign will see that we have put out very detailed plans that are bold, they are direct, and they are in the mainstream. But what folks are looking for is somebody to say them out loud. So that courage element I described a moment ago is an important part of what people are looking for in leadership. So, for example, on guns, it's not enough. You know, Molly will say, we need common sense gun reform. Okay, that and $3 will get you a cup of coffee. So how are you going to deal with homicide, the threat of mass shooting, domestic violence, and the big one in New Hampshire, suicide? How are you going to do it? So I have a 7-point plan that is specific. I back it up with data. I've taken it on the road. We've done 90-minute town hall meetings just on guns. To me, when you get out there, you should be able to do that once you've done the homework on different issues. We did the same thing on campaign finance reform. Molly says, let's get the dark money out of politics. Okay, that and $3 will get you a cup of coffee. So what are you going to do about it? I am the first candidate in at least a generation in New Hampshire to propose the public funding of elections. It is the only way to fundamentally change a system that is broken. Not only did I do it, it's in great detail on the website. It'll cost between 4.2 and 6.3 million bucks a year. It works. It fundamentally changes the game and attracts in-state low-dollar contributions instead of large dollar or corporate or PAC or out-of-state money. Those are examples, and I've got them across the board, where it's bolder, it's more specific, it's thoughtful, and it's in the mainstream, but it represents how we're going to define the future of the party. Molly speaks largely in vague terms, avoids detail, avoids forums and debates. And that is the opposite of what people are looking for in the age of Trump.
Well, and we had invited again former Senator Kelly to be with us side by side with you today, hoping that listeners would get a chance to compare and contrast you on the issues and style. And she declined that invitation, although she was with us on June 18th of this year. So if people want to look up her positions on gun control and so forth, they can go to our website, nhpr.org/exchange. In this primary campaign, Mr. Marchand, you've talked a lot about your youth and energy to the point where some of Ms. Kelly's supporters have said you're being ageist. What's the point you're trying to make there?
Well, first, that charge, based on the lack of public or media interest in it, it was a bogus charge. But anybody who knows me, and I've been on this show many times over many years, the one thing they will say is I'm an Energizer bunny. I think it comes across at events, it comes across over the airwaves, and it's going to be necessary because of the nature of the work going on. So to me, it's not about the thing on your birth certificate. It's about just who you are and what your DNA is like. And I think even when I was running unopposed for the first year that I was a candidate, it's the exact same language I used then. But I think what people are looking for is they want a certain dynamism. Where are we going as a state? And there's an accountability that comes across when you say, here's exactly where I'm at. Here's how I plan to do it. Here are the plans. It's on the website. Here's the dollars behind it. Here's how I hope to pay for it. And then all of our events, we put them on Facebook Live if the technology allows for it. So not only do we try to get everywhere, and we've done almost 300 meet and greet style events, but we also try to always put them live so that people that cannot make the events can as well. I'll tell you what, I have been around politics a long time, and I have heard a lot of politicians criticize other politicians for the details of their plan, and that's fair game. But I have never before this campaign seen a politician criticize somebody else for having plans. That is not a bug. That's a feature. And it turns out voters really like that, too.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned Facebook Live because I want to let our listeners know that in addition to listening to our interview with Steve Marchand today, you can watch it on Facebook Live. So go ahead and do that if you'd like. You can give us a call to 1-800-892-6477 or send us an email, exchange@nhpr.org. And Mr. Marchand, we got a lot of questions in advance from our listeners, so I want to share some of them with you. You said that you've been around politics for a long time. We got a question from Diane who wanted to know about your political background. Diane says, how did your experiences with no labels influence you? And what are some specific ways that you expect this to inform your governorship? So, Diane, thank you for that question. And Mr. Marchand, before you answer her question, how would you describe the group you worked for, No Labels?
So I've been self-employed. I was a mayor in Portsmouth. I was the director of corporate relations. I've also been self-employed, largely doing audits of city, county, and state governments. I'm a public administrator by background. I've also done some consulting with groups like AARP, the State Employees Association, and for a while, this group No Labels. The intent was, I think, very attractive, certainly at the beginning, which was to bring conservatives, liberals, moderates together. Can you get them in a room and see what they can agree on? An unimpeachable goal. But here's the thing I learned to the question. In the era of Trump, the way that you are going to get to the policy goals that I'm espousing in this campaign is unfortunately not going to be by bringing people together in a kumbaya type atmosphere and hoping that if you come to the middle, the other side will come to the middle too. If that were true, then we would be talking in a future show about how effective or ineffective Supreme Court Justice Merrick Garland was. We would be talking about paid family leave that Chris Sununu signed. We would be talking about the DACA vote that Donald Trump promised. He said, if you give me my budget, within 90 days, I'll give you a DACA vote. I promise. Barack Obama said, I know I got a Republican U.S. Senate. And so because of that, I will nominate a 63-year-old moderate justice. And the Republicans, Mitch McConnell said, I won't even let you have a hearing about it. And then 11 days after Donald Trump gets inaugurated, he puts a 47-year-old conservative up and they jam it through.
So what about No Labels? Yeah. What about your work there? Are you rejecting the sort of culture or ethos of No Labels?
I think it would be wonderful if that could work. But I think in this culture, the experience I get from that is you always reach out, you always try. But the reality is, just as it was after Watergate, and I mentioned this at all my meet and greets, the last time it was this messy, the only way that you're going to get where you want to go in public policy, when you get in a unique era like this one we're in right now, it is not going to be by persuading Chris Sununu or Donald Trump. It's going to be by replacing Chris Sununu and Donald Trump.
So I've heard you say that before on the campaign trail. So in terms of no labels, what you learned from that is it doesn't work?
I wish it worked, but in this era, I don't think that's the way that you're going to get where we need to go.
So one example that comes to mind is the Affordable Care Act. And the critique of the Affordable Care Act was that it passed with just Democratic support in the U.S. House and Senate. There was not a single Republican who voted for that bill. And then afterwards, people said, gee, maybe it wouldn't be so controversial if the Obama administration had gone out and gotten more Republican support, tried to get at least a couple Republican votes. So is that an example of that sort of all or nothing style that you're talking about not working?
Before, in that example, if you listen to the history of it, before Barack Obama and congressional leaders, I think this was in late 2009, even pitched the bill, what became the Affordable Care Act. Paul Ryan put out a press release that morning, like 3 hours before the press conference to begin to roll it out, saying that they were against it. They didn't even see the plan yet. When Barack Obama got elected, Mitch McConnell famously said, our goal is to make Barack Obama a one-term president. It is very difficult when you start with the other side from that position. It is very difficult to see where you go from there.
Well, of course, in fairness, any party wants to make the other party's president a one-term president.
At a minimum, they're smart enough not to say it out loud like 48 hours. I mean, what do you communicate with? So, look, do you always look to work with the other side? Of course you do, because there are places where you can agree in theory. But the political culture we're in right now, and the Merrick Garland is probably the highest profile example. But here in New Hampshire, Chris Sununu campaigned last time around saying he was in favor of paid family medical leave, which I am, and I have a very specific plan to pay for it. We can talk about it if you wish in a moment. But then the legislature seemed poised to pass a bill that was, with all due respect, a very watered-down version of a paid family medical leave bill that had an opt-in element. The funding was kind of wobbly, but at least it got something on the board. That was the point. When it looked like it might get to Sununu, Sununu said, oh, I'm against it. It involves money, as if we just learned that paid family medical leave isn't free. And he said it will lead to a backdoor income tax. So even when people tried to come halfway on something he said he would support in theory with the weakest form that could get through, he then not only opposed it, he used the old Mel Thompson, Bill Loeb, the pledge line and threw the whole thing out. He is part of that culture.
And we did a whole program on that, so I'll set it aside for now. There were a lot of questions about the funding.
But he was
Governor Sununu
against
wasn't
it.
the only one that had questions.
His problem is it involves money. And the problem with a proposal without funding in my business, we call that an idea.
So let's talk about taxes then, because Republicans have gone after both you and Senator Kelly, saying you basically never met a tax increase that you didn't like. And they, for example, are saying that you have proposed or suggested raising the gas tax. So what about that? If you were governor, would you raise the gas tax?
Well, yeah, I want to correct them. I did not suggest I'd raise the gas tax. I am saying I would raise the gas tax.
Clearly.
By 4 cents a gallon. It'd be about $30 million a year. Again, the RGA, the Republican Governors Association, they come to a lot of my events to videotape me, to catch me saying things like that. If they want, they could stay home and just watch it on Facebook Live. It'd be a lot cheaper for them. But let's be direct. I got 352 red list bridges that need repairing with no funding source attached to them over the next 10 years. I'm a former mayor. I audit cities for a living. I've seen the best and worst around the country. The reality is that if I tell you that your town has 7 bridges and 5 of them are doing just fine, that is not a comforting feeling. And it does not send a positive message to the private sector that they should be investing generationally in New Hampshire if we in the public sector will not invest generationally in our infrastructure.
So a 4 cent per gallon increase in the gas tax.
That's my proposal.
So another listener wanted to know about your position on taxes. This one came from Bob. He says, would you support a constitutional amendment that would require all revenue raised by a state income tax to be spent only on education? Bob, thank you for the question.
I've not been proposing that, and I tend to be against that for 2 reasons. Number one, I think that constitutional amendments as a way of creating public policy is generally not a good way to go because it is, by design, really hard. It's very difficult to pass a constitutional amendment. So if you build a public policy where one of the elements to make it work is a constitutional amendment, I think you're putting yourself in a position where you're likely to fail. So that's a mechanical reason. The other element is I don't think that the Constitution is designed to be able to be getting in the weeds generally of that level of specificity about what is a biennial budget process.
Well, I think it's a way to guarantee that any money that would be raised by a potential income tax would only go towards information. So it feels like Bob is asking, as a matter of security, that money would not be siphoned off for other purposes.
Look, if I'm not mistaken, I don't believe that the gas tax revenue right now, which is dedicated by law to infrastructure related, I don't believe that's a constitutional element. It's done through legislation. And I think that to be intellectually consistent, you would do the same thing with any other revenue, which is a separate conversation from what revenue sources you'd even be talking about.
So to what's implied in his question, an income tax. And another listener also asked Steve about this. He says, I've been trying to determine your stance on an income tax. Would you sign an income tax if it came across your desk? And Steve, thank you for that question.
No, I would not. But I would say this. We live in a state where Mel Thompson and Bill Loeb set the rules in around 1972, and we continue to play by those rules. We have a 19th century form of government. In my auditing work, when I talk to my peers and I tell them I'm from New Hampshire, they say when we want to know what American governance looked like in the 19th century, we come to New Hampshire today. So I tell folks I'd love to take New Hampshire into the 21st century on governance to lower your property taxes and improve your public services, but I would settle for the 20th century. That would be an improvement. And in terms of this, culturally, we need to start moving away from this antiquated way of looking at the way we raise and spend money. It's incredibly inefficient. It is so parochial. We act like 234 communities that happen to be drawn around one state border, and it means that we have the second highest administrative cost per pupil in education in any state in the country. It means we get sued for our mental health system and we lose the lawsuit. It means we're probably going to get sued for a Claremont lawsuit style again in the near future.
So it sounds like you're saying we need more revenue.
I am saying we need more revenue.
So would you impose go for an income tax or not?
I would not, but I would do this. I start with the, quote, easy stuff. Number one, and none of this is easy. Number one is I would reverse the business profits tax cut of the last few years, a cut that, by the way, Molly voted for in the state Senate, which Chris Sununu will surely note on a general election stage if she's the nominee. That's $100 million a year.
Of course, now she says she would reverse it.
Well, there's a lot of things like that. That's one. Two is I mentioned the gas tax increase. That would be about $30 million a year at 4 cents increase. And then a third thing would be I would regulate and legalize cannabis for adult use. As you know, I have had that position for some time. Molly also has moved to that position, but the state party now has it in its platform, and we will literally be surrounded by legalization by the end of this calendar year. And that actually means the revenue you can expect from it is probably dropping because the free market, will compete around. So I say that's about $35 million a year. One other thing, I think that local governments should have the right to use income as an element in determining tax liability. That's an important policy distinction.
On their property taxes.
It's not that sexy, but it's really important. About 17 states have some form of this, typically called a circuit breaker, that basically in the long run ensures that you will not pay more than a certain percentage of your income in property tax.
And New Hampshire towns, a lot of them have that. They have circuit breakers for the poor and the elderly.
Well, it's very targeted, and you could clean out a lot of those exemptions if you simply allowed towns to be able to do it town-wide. Because let's face it, if you're 47 years old and you lose your job, right now in New Hampshire, I got nothing for you.
All right. Well, coming up in a minute, we will talk about some of the other issues in this primary race, the Democratic primary for the New Hampshire governor. It's Steve Marchand and Molly Kelly. Again, Molly Kelly declined our invitation to appear with Mr. Marchand today. So Mr. Marchand has the mic, and we'll be talking with him in just a moment. Stay with us. This is The Exchange on NHPR.
NHPR's environmental reporter Annie Ropeek has been taking us on a rare tour of a Superfund site, the Seacoast Coakley landfill. Tomorrow, why neighbors say it's still dangerous. That's Morning Edition tomorrow morning from 5 till 9 here on NHPR. Support for NHPR comes from you, our listeners, and from Edvest in You, a local New Hampshire nonprofit specializing in college student loans and student refinancing options. Information online at nhstudentloans.org. And from the Wentworth Douglas Hospital Center for Weight Management and Bariatric Surgery in Dover, with information sessions for men and women, 833-WD-NEW-ME for registration. Cloudy, some showers and thunderstorms likely today. Some of the storms could have heavy rainfall. Humid, highs today upper 70s to lower 80s. Mostly cloudy tonight, chance of showers, areas of fog after midnight, lows tonight in the low to mid 60s. This is NHPR.
This is The Exchange. I'm Laura Kanoy. Today, Democratic gubernatorial candidate Steve Marchand is with us. He and former state Senator Molly Kelly are competing for the party's gubernatorial nomination. Both candidates have appeared on The Exchange before, and we extended an invitation for them to appear together before the primary so listeners could compare their positions. Ms. Kelly declined, so Steve Marchand is here. And let's hear from you. Your questions about the issues you hear Democrats talking about this year, 1-800-892-6477. Send us an email, exchange@nhpr.org. Again, exchange@nhpr.org. Respond on Facebook or Twitter at NHPR Exchange. One more time, that number, 1-800-892-6477. And Mr. Marchand, lots of questions from our listeners coming in. Here's Gavin in Plainfield, who says, how can the state of New Hampshire protect rural areas while so much political focus is on the development and business recruitment? Conservation of rural areas requires resources and creative planning that have been left forever at the hyper-local level. Does Mr. Marchand have any ideas? And Gavin, thank you for raising that issue. Go ahead, Mr. Marchand.
It's a great question. One of the great things about campaigning the way we have in this intensely grassroots 300 town hall type event style, I do some teaching, like who the heck is this guy and why does he want to be governor? I'm doing a lot of learning, and you identify patterns. So to Gavin's question, whether you're talking about forest management practices in Coos County, or you're talking about the ability for communities to control local water if somebody wants to privatize it and bottle it, there's actually some similarities in the public policy. And there are a handful of areas where local control, intended or not, gets usurped by state law that allows large entities to be able to do things in deforestation, being able to privatize water, and so forth. So as somebody with a lot of family way up at the border, as we were talking about, up in Pittsburgh, West Stewartstown, Colebrook, I've spent dozens of visits in Sullivan County and all over Grafton, you name it. I have taken seriously the idea that anything we do for one part of the state, we need to think about in all parts of the state. So when I think about economic development, I reject the idea of, let's focus on tourism. For rural New Hampshire. That tends to be the default for politicians, especially in the northern part of the state. Go to the big towns, in these parts of the state. They have a skeleton of a wonderful downtown in many cases. That places like Windham and Bedford, which are great in their own way, but they don't have that. And there is an attractiveness for a younger population that is disproportionately entrepreneurial, that wants to live in a certain lifestyle. So, and even in a place like Colebrook, if Colebrook got a net extra 1,000 people in the next 10 years that had that kind of background, the economic impact would be significant. But the problem in much of rural New Hampshire is because of our property tax system we're so over-reliant. It means that for towns that don't have a vibrant property tax base, they are unable to make the public investments which attract private investment and begin the virtuous cycle of growing local economies.
So how would you tackle that as governor, given that you said you are not interested in imposing an income tax or sales tax right now? I didn't even ask you about sales tax.
Right, and the sales tax actually I have the biggest problem with because I find that it's regressive and that it tends to get lobbied in states that have it where, my product is a luxury. So you can't, that is not a luxury. You should not. You should exempt it from sales tax. It becomes a feeding frenzy for lobbyists in states, and it's regressive. I have a real problem with that. And by the way, for what it's worth, we do have a sales tax, by the way. It just depends what you buy.
Rooms and meals.
Yeah, and we do have an income tax. It just depends how you make the money.
Who you are.
Yeah. So, I mean, we talk about it, the ghost of Mel Thompson rears its head, and there you are. In the long run, one is I need to begin the process of additional state revenue. I've mentioned a handful of ways.
Increased gas taxes.
Right, and the cannabis and the reversal of the business profits tax. I think we also, in the budget, and I've talked to former governors about this, want to put carrots in the budget that strongly encourage local governments to collaborate on administrative functions. Again, this is not sexy, but man, it's a big deal.
Well, people have been talking about this for a long time, that we have all these small towns who all have their own, fire station or their own
Everything.
school district. Now, there is a fair bit of collaboration. I mean, you're familiar with regional school units, SAUs, and so forth.
Yes.
So you're saying you would promote that more as a way to save money.
And there are a number of places in my travels over the last couple of years in the state where they would like to consolidate or collaborate, but that there is an initial expense, sometimes capital, sometimes operating, that they are unable to do something about. And I would note, at the same 15-year period that we have lost 25% of our school population, we have added 10% more school administrative units. And that's a big part of the driver of why we now have the second highest administrative cost per pupil of any state in America. It means you're paying more property taxes, but the money's not staying in the classroom. And in most of the country, including red states like Wyoming and Mississippi, you name it, this is something that 100 years ago they began to address, because otherwise, they said, your property taxes will be crazy and your local services will slowly diminish. And they were right.
Well, we talked about rural New Hampshire. So here's another one from rural New Hampshire. Merrill is watching from Facebook Live in Alexandria, New Hampshire. And Merrill says, is Steve Marchand against Northern Pass? Merrill, thank you. And I want to remind everybody, in addition to listening today, you can watch our interview with Steve Marchand on Facebook Live. So go ahead.
Thank you for that very easy to answer question. Yes. And people that have followed me over the
Northern
years,
Pass.
I am against Northern Pass. I first was against it when my aunt, a retired dairy farmer in Pittsburgh, let my parents know that this pass project, this is like 7 years ago now, was going to potentially be going near or through her property. And that concerned her and then my parents and then me greatly. Then you go into the policy. It wouldn't save ratepayers money in any kind of significant way. We act as an energy superhighway with no exit ramps between Canada and southern New England. And it would diminish property values in the communities where it would go through, and it would delay where we need to go on energy. And I've got by far the most specific comprehensive plan of anybody running on this, that we need to move rapidly towards renewables and conservation-related policy. Northern Pass would really halt that because of the change it would make in the energy economy.
So a couple questions on this, and Merrill, thank you for raising it. First of all, in terms of the governor, he or she doesn't really have a say on Northern Pass. It's decided by the Site Evaluation Committee, which recently said no. Now that's in the courts. So how does the governor really play a role in this?
Well, actually, you're right, but there are a surprising number of ways that the governor does play a role. First example. So Chris Sununu, who has been a longtime supporter of the project, as well as anything PSNH or Eversource touches, was up in Quebec for a conference. And he stood next to the Premier of Quebec. This was early in 2017. Reaffirmed his support of Northern Pass. And the Premier of Quebec said that the people of New Hampshire must support Northern Pass because the governor they just elected supports Northern Pass. And this is what I tell folks. Chris Sununu goes up to Quebec, stands next to the Premier of Quebec, and says in English that he supports Northern Pass.
Well, hang on, that's not really fair.
Je peux aller au Québec, près de la Premier de Québec, et dit en français que je suis contre Northern Pass.
But that's
Parce
not
que
really
le
fair
monde
to
de New Hampshire.
criticize Chris Sununu for not speaking French. Maybe he speaks Spanish. I don't know.
Well, I don't think so. And here's the other thing. I'll tell you what the people of Quebec do speak. They speak the language of commerce. And as a dual citizen, would be the first French-Canadian governor in the history of New Hampshire, in a state that is rich in that history. Bombardier has $1.2 billion of projects for subway cars in places like San Francisco and New York. They are looking, because of the Buy in America provision, they need some of that production to occur in the States. Chris Sununu went up there and did not wow them. And they are looking in northern New York and Vermont, Maine, and New Hampshire, the opportunity to put manufacturing in New Hampshire near the border. I think I uniquely can help accelerate relationships like that. It's our most important trade partner. It is sitting on a T if we are willing to accelerate that relationship.
So in terms of your critique of Northern Pass, saying that it wouldn't reduce rates for New Hampshire ratepayers, a lot of business groups, Mr. Marchand, as you know, were in favor of Northern Pass. They said, look, we've got to diversify our economy. We've got to diversify our energy sources, as you have said. This is a good way to lower rates. And by the way, you support renewable energy. So hydro, some people say, is renewable. So, lots of people besides the governor supported Northern Pass.
Well, it's a certain subset of our population that, frankly, is largely dominating Planet Concord and has for the last generation. It is a small number of entities that represent a small number of large businesses. And while I appreciate our large businesses, Let's be honest, 80% of net new job creation in our state and our country comes from new and small businesses. And cutting the business profits tax by $100 million a year. I was the director of corporate relations for UNH. I spent a lot of time with CEOs and heads of HR and heads of engineering. They did not ask for that tax cut. They asked for America's best pre-K through 12 public education. They asked for infrastructure investment. They asked for us to deal with addiction and recovery in a healthcare-based, long-term, holistic way, because that has an economic impact as well. And they want us to build a culture of entrepreneurship, because that ultimately is how we're going to build an economy that reflects the opportunity of the next generation. Northern Pass was not going to lower rates by any significant margin. But if we upgrade the electric grid, if we move to a 50% renewable portfolio standard by 2030, like our neighbors are set to do, if we eliminate the net metering cap, the number of jobs we create and the ability to lower people's electric bills in 15 years by 15 to 20%, that's the kind of savings we're talking about. And it will create jobs in a New Hampshire-centric kind of way. It's much better for our environment. Molly has proposed nothing close to this sort of dynamism. She leans as her seminal accomplishment in 10 years in the state Senate as introducing a net metering bill, which passed unanimously. Even Andy Sanborn voted for it. And 5 years into its existence, we have 0.5% of our electricity coming from solar. So let us not overstate the magnitude of the accomplishment.
So what would you do in terms of net metering? As you know, the solar industry wants the cap eliminated.
Eliminate the cap. Other states that have done that have seen an explosion. Vermont, 10% solar. Massachusetts, 8% solar, and moving up quick. When I took the time to ask people across the spectrum on these issues, what would be the public policies that would do the most to accelerate both conservation and renewable-related in-state technology and investment? The answer was clear after a while. It was dramatic, communicate to the private sector sustainable long-term rewards for investing in renewables and in conservation. So take the RPS standard. That's the renewable portfolio standard. That's right, which is set to be 25% renewables by 2025. And make it 50% by 2030.
Well, I got a question from a listener about that. So let me throw it at you, Mr. Marchand. John says you support increasing the state's RPS, as you said, renewable portfolio standard, from 25% by 2025 to 50% by 2030. John says, how much will this cost ratepayers in the state?
This is a dramatically overstated argument by those that typically have an interest against the increase in renewables as a percentage of the pie. In the short term, it is a very small amount of money. The exact number somewhat based on what the mix of sources would look like. But the real thing here is, in New Hampshire, this is the 19th century thought process I'm talking about. Because we have a 2-year governor's seat, only us in Vermont have that, it feeds this very short-term way of thinking about problem solving. We have generational opportunities and threats. If we do not think generationally about the future of energy policy, the economic benefits, the environmental benefits, and the drawbacks if we do not act, then we will continue to do what we traditionally have done, frankly, under both parties oftentimes, which is to do little things at a time when big ideas are required with specific ideas and tactics about how to get there.
So Vermont has the 2-year governorship and New Hampshire has a 2-year governorship, and you're saying that leads to short-term thinking. On the other hand, Vermont is a hotbed of renewables, so doesn't seem like the 2-year governorship has hurt.
There are a number of reasons why.
There.
I mean, I think anybody who spent time in New Hampshire and Vermont will acknowledge there are dramatic cultural differences as well, and economic differences. So the 2-year term is only one of them. 400-member legislature is another one. The executive, this is designed to make it difficult to do things in a bigger picture going back over 2 centuries. But the consequences of not having leadership that goes big and bold and then is willing to put it out there with the numbers behind it and then make the case. Your point earlier, what role can the governor play in some of these topics? The bully pulpit is a significant element. It's one of the greatest tools in a, frankly, otherwise weak governor's position. And we need a governor who is willing to lead and define the future, both for our party as well as for the state of New Hampshire.
Well, and coming up in about 10 or 15 minutes, NHPR's Josh Rogers will be with us to talk about the governor's race and also some of the things that you mentioned, Mr. Marchand, the idea that it's a weak governorship and how you work around that. Lots of questions coming in from our listeners. This is great. So thanks to everybody. Again, our number 1-800-892-6477. Send us an email, exchange@nhpr.org. Respond on Facebook or Twitter @NHPR Exchange. And you can listen and watch our interview today on Facebook Live if you'd like. As I said, lots of questions coming in now and before the show, Mr. Marchand. Here's one that came in before the show, a question from a listener about prisons and so forth. So let's hear.
My name is Beatrice Coulter. I'm from Concord, and I would like to know how you would address the current practice of transferring civilly committed individuals from New Hampshire Hospital to the prison. Thank you.
Well, and thank you for that question, Beatrice. And this has been a big issue. Before you answer her question, please, just remind listeners how this is set up now, what she means by civilly committed state hospital versus the secure psychiatric unit.
Well, in the big picture, I would argue, one might disagree, because of the severe shortage we have of mental health services to give people the services they need in a best practices sort of way. The practical effect is that people that have a violation of their background and would be in a prison situation will end up being put there and are generally lacking the mental health services that you would expect them in a best practices scenario to receive. The consequences of that are several. One is that if people are released at a certain point, they are much more likely to experience recidivism because they are not getting the services that lead them to a place where they can live a fuller, balanced, and productive life. But the other part of it is that it ends up in a lag. And I have family members. This was actually in a story in, I think, the AP this morning, and this came up yesterday. I have experienced the mental health system as a family member over the course of this campaign. I've had somebody who I care about very much who made an attempt.
A suicide attempt?
Yeah.
I'm
and was
sorry to hear
unsuccessful. And so I have learned a lot outside of a policy area. I have learned a lot as a family member. And I could tell you that what scares members of my family is about as much as anything, and I've got a lot going on right now, is the idea that the counselor who is doing so much to improve the quality of life of this person I love very much might decide one day to take another job.
There's been a lot of turnover in the mental health system.
Any family member who is experiencing what I and a lot of people now that I meet, they will describe that fear. And you feel like you don't have any control. My wife has been on the board of Seacoast Mental Health for some time because of other family members on her side of the family. It's something we've been concerned about for a long time. She is familiar with how much people get paid, the turnover, the amazing work they do. Amazing work they do. We used to have, when I was a kid, one of the best mental health systems per capita in the country. Some would say the best. And then we got sued because under both parties, because the way we raise and spend money, whether you're talking about the ed funding or talking about what, but on mental health, we lost a lawsuit because we don't provide the minimal level of services that are required. And so the consequences spill all over the place. It spills into our prison system because we kind of have to dish people off in places because we're not doing it the right way. It means people, and I experienced this, will end up in an emergency room situation, and then they may stay there for days, in our case, or weeks. In other cases, they're not equipped to handle it. It's a crisis.
I'm really, really sorry to hear about what you're going through. I'm sure that's really, really hard for you, especially in the midst of a hot campaign. So I'm sorry to hear that. As governor, how would you change the way things are moving now? As I'm sure you know, there are efforts after this lawsuit. There is funding. The ship is starting to move when it comes to mental health. We did a whole series on this earlier in the summer on New Hampshire's mental health system. So, as Steve Marchand governor, what's like the number one or number two steps that you would take?
On this specific issue?
Yeah.
First, I'm going to just say it. We're cheap. We are cheap. On these things that matter to people, New Hampshire sometimes is so cheap. And that means that we got to say difficult but necessary things that affect people's lives in a fundamental way, and then get out there and make the case. And it's not just on this. It's the way I try to do it on guns and stuff that's frankly less, visceral to people's lives, like campaign finance reform, but are really important. But on these things that change lives, like we think we're being frugal, but we're being cheap because we pay on the back end. You don't pay now, you pay so much more later. And so it took way more than 2 years to get into the situation that we're in. And it's going to take more than 2 years to get out of it. But I tell folks sometimes that the only way that I'm going to get a second term as governor in what is likely to be a very difficult budget process because of the way the last budget was, a lot of the fun was up front, a lot of the pain is on the back end. I've got to be willing to govern like I'm comfortable being a one-term governor. That's the only way that the people in New Hampshire will give me a second term.
Well, and you've talked about, the short term that we have here in New Hampshire and how that affects policy making and short-term thinking. And we got an email to that effect, Mr. Marchand, from Jerry in Dover. He says one of the largest problems in New Hampshire is the $100 a year legislator. These many geriatrics are solidly against any legislation that costs money. We need to pay legislators a viable wage in order to attract new blood with forward-looking visions. Jerry, thank you for that point. And, others have made this point that the legislature, let's face it, skews older, partly because if you need to work a regular paying job, you can't really afford to spend all the time that it takes to be there. So what do you think about Jerry's proposal, paying legislators a viable wage, as he puts it?
Well, I would probably push back on some of the specific language in his email. I appreciate what he's trying to say. And look, I've got specific and important ideas on immigration and taxes and education and campaign finance reform and guns and abortion rights. And so my plate, I'm setting myself up for a pretty full plate. So, that said, I think that I appreciate anybody who runs for local office or for the legislature because they're not getting paid, but they're working really hard. So even people I don't agree with on the time of day, I try to say to them, I appreciate your willingness to serve because somebody's got to do it and you're willing to do it. I don't believe we're going to be in a position to significantly increase pay in a way that would change the nature of the schedule. But not that long ago, in my lifetime, the legislature typically didn't meet as a group very often in the second year of the biennial process because this was supposed to be a volunteer job.
That's right. They would come in for the budget process in the first part of the session, but in the last part of it, they would come in on an as-needed basis.
So it has turned into this much bigger job. So it may be counterintuitive to some, but I think in the short term anyway, I'm more interested in seeing what we can do to make it more doable in terms of the schedule and commitment to a larger swath demographically of the population. It's also one of the reasons I'm such a big fan of campaign finance reform that includes the public funding of elections, because you now have to spend a lot of your time, especially like state senate, executive council, more than rep, but raising money. So you're always on the clock.
Well, thank you for the question, Jerry. I appreciate it. And Mr. Marchand, we got a lot of questions from our listeners on one particular topic. So I want to throw it at you before we close out, including this one from Sue in Hillsborough, who stopped by with a handwritten note for you this morning.
Okay.
She didn't get around to sending an email. She couldn't call in. So here you go, Sue. But a lot of people asked about this, not just Sue. She says, I understand you support renewables and increased energy efficiency for New Hampshire. You are among the very few candidates running this fall to specifically oppose the Granite Bridge pipeline. Can you explain why you think this is an important step toward New Hampshire energy independence and mitigating climate change? Thank you, Sue. And by the way, we got a lot of questions about this.
This is coming up everywhere. And Granite Bridge it would be basically a natural gas pipeline roughly from Manchester towards the coast. Think of Route 101. That's the layman's element. I do oppose it, and I'm the only candidate that opposes it. There are a number of reasons. Environmentally, natural gas is a bridge technology for a bridge we're already over. We've already crossed that bridge. Almost 2/3 of electricity in New England comes from natural gas already. So we should be moving in the opposite direction, not doubling down. On an economic front, whenever you take any source of energy, in this case, natural gas, and you start moving towards 70% or more of your stock coming from one source, and it's a source that is being traded internationally now, you create tremendous volatility on prices in the long run. So it's bad for ratepayers. But environmentally, the fracking process through which this is derived is negative for the environment on many levels, and we don't need to go there.
Although there's concern that we are not able to get natural gas, which is abundant in other parts of the country, into New England because we don't have the pipeline capacity.
Well, part of the reason folks say that is because they look at peak demand. A lot of this comes around think of the hottest and coldest days of the year. Peak demand, if you deal with conservation, this is where upgrade of the electric grid, you can lower the peak demand in a way that will change this conversation and allow us, with the renewable portfolio standard of 50%, elimination of the net metering cap, aggressive funding of Reggie's energy efficiency, which is a whole other conversation.
Sure.
We can lower demand, especially at peaks, and change the conversation on it.
Well, and speaking of conversations, we've run out of time. I'd love to ask you some more about the conservation and so forth, but we'll close it out there, Mr. Marchand. I really appreciate you coming in today.
Well,
thank
I
you very much.
Thank you.
That's Steve Marchand, Democratic candidate for governor, former Portsmouth mayor, who's held a number of positions in politics, business, and with the university system. Coming up, we'll sit down with NHPR's Josh Rogers for a quick recap of this gubernatorial campaign here in the Granite State. Stay with us.
The White House has confirmed that some staffers have signed confidentiality agreements, often called NDAs. As a businessman, Donald Trump routinely used them to protect the Trump Organization's secrets. But can public employees be bound by a private agreement? Discord over non-disclosure. Next time on 1A.
That's this morning at 10 here on NHPR. Support for NHPR comes from your listeners and from Courier's Leather Furniture, featuring stressless leather sofas and chairs, providing neck and lumbar support in every position, and over 75 pieces in stock. CouriersLeather.com. And from Ed Riley Subaru in Concord, a local family-run business serving the needs of central New Hampshire, Subaru owners and buyers for over 24 years. Details at EdRileySubaru.com. Cloudy, some showers and thunderstorms likely today. Some of the storms could have heavy rainfall. Humid, highs today upper 70s to lower 80s. This is NHPR.
This is The Exchange. I'm Laura Kanoy. Today, we're focusing on the New Hampshire governor's race, and with us now is NHPR's Josh Rogers to give us an overall recap of this race. Let's take your questions, too. You can send an email to exchange@nhpr.org. Again, that's exchange@nhpr.org. Respond on Facebook or Twitter at NHPR Exchange, or give us a call, 1-800-892-6477. And along with listening to our show today, you can watch it on Facebook Live. And Josh, welcome back. It's great to see you.
Good to see you, Laura.
So a little Civics 101 first, because Steve Marchand did mention this. Why is New Hampshire's governorship just a 2-year term?
Well, it's what the Constitution requires. I think it's Part 2, Article 42.
Wow, that's pretty good.
It springs from, framers' distrust of unaccountable power. Vermont is the only other state that has a 2-year term. There have been efforts to revisit this. They've never really taken. It's a high hurdle. You need a supermajority in both houses of the legislature, then 2/3 of the public.
Because it would be a constitutional amendment.
And, the recurrent criticism is that making governors run every 2 years is inefficient, makes it hard to govern.
Right. That was the point that Steve Marchand made.
But it is the system we have, and one political upshot of that is that governors who do get elected tend to get a second term without much controversy. One exception to that recently was Craig Benson back in 2004, but before that you have to go back a good deal of time, like a century, to find somebody who got tossed after one term.
How often do we see, Josh, competitive primaries in the governor's race? Is there usually an anointed favorite, like Chris Sununu was last time, or do we sometimes see vigorous races for the nomination?
I'm not sure I would say Chris Sununu was anointed last time. It was an open seat. There was a lot of interest in both parties. Oftentimes there is a favorite and there is an outsider, and sometimes there are multiple candidates. Certainly.
Actually, that's true last time. I stand corrected because Frank Edelblut came pretty close to Chris Sununu.
Well, he wasn't
in the
expected
primary.
to, but he came quite close. And there were others who were seen as viable at the beginning of the race. In this race, if you were to look at the traditional markers, Molly Kelly would be anointed, at least by the Democratic establishment. We'll see what that does for her on primary day. You can, go down from Jean Sheen and Maggie Hassan and Ann McLean Custer to what you could call Democratic-affiliated groups, such as the big teachers' unions and even Planned Parenthood, and leaders in the New Hampshire legislature among Democrats have all gotten behind Molly Kelly. Steve Marchand, meanwhile, has been running, more or less nonstop since 2016, when he came in second the Democratic primary distantly to Colin Van Ostern. The dynamic in this race is sort of a insider, outsider. Molly Kelly had 5 terms in the legislature. She's from Harrisville. She represented the Keene area. Interestingly, she never had a primary as a state senator, and I think that somewhat explains her disinclination to engage to the degree that Steve Marchand has in debates and forums such as this, where she obviously refused to come. We'll see what happens. Primaries are tricky. You don't know, and in a year when the governor's race is the top of the ticket, you don't have big money coming in a presidential race. The organizing efforts that come if there was a U.S. Senate contest we don't really know how many votes it's going to take to win this primary. I mean, most people think it's going to be in the, somewhere in the 20,000s. That's not necessarily a huge number of votes to muster. Steve Marchand says his grassroots organizing has gotten him close to that number. We'll see. He doesn't have a lot of money. Molly Kelly has all those affiliated groups who can help turn out votes. The effect of the Trump presidency is something that no one really knows what it's going to mean.
So the fact that Molly Kelly has almost all the establishment support sewn up, not just the congressional delegation, but those big sort of Democratic-leaning groups like Planned Parenthood, like the Teachers Union. You're saying, yes, Josh, that's good, but don't count Steve Marchand out given the particular dynamics of this year.
I think that's fair, and you don't want to go too far down this route. I mean, Steve Marchand's obviously saying, I'm running from the Bernie Sanders wing of the party. Is you discussed. He hasn't always been there. He says it's now the direction the party needs to go. Molly Kelly is coming from a different place politically. She's certainly liberal, and in terms of the differences between them on policy, it's a little hard to tease that out given how inexplicit she's been and how explicit he has been on so many issues. But we don't really know what's going to happen here. I mean, you look back to a race the last time there was a primary between Maggie Hassan and Jackie Silly. Maggie Hassan ended up winning that primary easily, and it was a similar dynamic in terms of most of the institutional support going to her. Jackie Silly was exciting grassroots activists, and right up until the end there was some suspense. But then when it came to turning out the vote, then Governor Hassan's, or former then State Senator Hassan's campaign did a much better job.
One more question about just sort of the mechanics of this, because it's interesting. There's a very hotly contested Democratic primary, as you know, Josh, in the 1st congressional district, 10 or 11 Democrats running. So lots of people in that eastern chunk of the state will turn out to vote. Lots of Democrats will be more likely to turn out to vote maybe than on the western side, just because of that exciting primary over there. How does that affect this dynamic for the governor's race?
Well, I mean, who knows? I mean, one would say that Steve Marchand being from Portsmouth, that might help him. But again, a lot of that turnout, we just don't know. I mean, there hasn't been a great deal of public polling in these races, and it's hard to know how that splits up the vote. So many candidates running. This is. I was talking to U.S. Senator Jeanne Shaheen yesterday at an event, and she's supportive of Chris Pappas in that primary, and she's like, "Well, you know where I stand, Josh," and of course I do. But I was curious to know what she thought about what it was going to mean for turnout and Democrats in general. And as you might expect her, she was talking pretty bullish about turnout, but until the votes are counted, we don't really know.
Sure. So issues, Josh, you've been covering this gubernatorial race, and we heard about some of the key issues from Mr. Marchand in our earlier segment. But what are some of the maybe top 2 or 3 issues that you hear these gubernatorial candidates talking about, and not just Kelly and Marchand, but Governor Sununu as well?
Well, certainly they're all talking about energy issues. Whether or not that's something that resonates with voters, maybe another thing. I mean, certainly Molly Kelly's talking up this net metering bill she sponsored. Steve Marchand is stressing the need for more renewable energy sources, and certainly, as we heard, his foursquare opposition to Granite Bridge pipeline. Kelly's been a little less clear, but she does have a background with some of these issues, as does Governor Sununu. They're going after him on his stances on some of the biomass bills, and he's, in turn pitching himself as a champion of ratepayers. We're certainly going to see a lot more of that, regardless of which Democrat gets out of the primary. The state obviously has high electricity costs. It's been a top concern for businesses for a long time, and that tends to be Chris Sununu's emphasis. It was his first campaign ad touched on these bills he vetoed. Democrats want to speed development of renewables and say that will create jobs. Again, this is what they're talking about. I'm not sure exactly where voters are at.
Yeah, it's interesting that energy has seemingly become an issue in this, and we got a lot of emails from our listeners for Mr. Marchand about energy, renewables, the pipeline, Northern Pass, and so forth. A lot of people in this campaign seem to be talking about immigration as well, Josh, which, in the past has been sort of a federal issue. But why are gubernatorial candidates talking about immigration?
Well, there are these ICE checkpoints that have been in New Hampshire, and, it's not uncommon to hear immigration on the right. We've certainly heard a lot of talk about it in the past. With the Trump administration's policies, it's an issue of concern. And for these candidates, one challenge is to kind of harness themselves to where the electorate's mind is at. And a lot of the electorate's mind is focusing on federal matters. And so it makes some sense that there's talk about this. I mean, Steve Marchand likes to play up his French Canadian heritage. He actually has dual citizenship. I think he'd be the first governor, should he get elected, to be a dual citizen. And he's actually put out a fairly ambitious plan to make New Hampshire a sanctuary state. By his definition, that would mean state and local law enforcement could deny requests from the federal government, from ICE, to detain illegal immigrants unless said immigrant was a convicted felon. He'd like to give undocumented immigrants the opportunity to get driver's licenses in New Hampshire, and he would expand in-state tuition to cover eligible children of illegal immigrants.
Yeah, and I did not get a chance, due to time constraints, to ask him about that. And the sanctuary states and the driver's licenses and the in-state tuition, that might play well with the Democratic base. I'm wondering if that would be controversial, Josh, with the broader electorate.
Well, I think his first goal is to get through the primary. I mean, he says that, he's learned in his long tenure in and around politics, and it hasn't been a straight line to the left, as you indicated just a couple years ago. He was working for no labels, as he said,
Centrist
it was
group,
sort of a nice idea, but not relevant in the age of Trump. And that, so, I mean, he says you've got to go big and lead, or the terms will be defined by others. We'll see. I think Republicans would be happy to run against some of those policies should he get through the primary. But again, this is going to be up to voters.
Well, and speaking of Republicans, how much has Governor Chris Sununu, Josh, strayed from that traditional Republican playbook? Because you heard Steve Marchand trying to, tie the governor in with the era of Trump and so forth.
Well, it depends on how you define traditional. I mean, Chris Sununu has cut taxes, which is a fairly traditional Republican goal. He's expanded gun rights. Again, a traditional Republican goal. He's appointed conservatives to big New Hampshire government posts. Commissioner Frank Edelblut at Education. He's gotten a couple Supreme Court justices. But he also got a bill to help pay for kindergarten through. He's extended transgender protections in state law. He's outlawed conversion therapy on minors. And there's the Medicaid bill that he and Republican leaders came together with Democrats on. So, a mixed bag. I mean, certainly he has things to point to. And, his relationship to Trump is going to be something that Democrats are going to stress. And, Governor Sununu has tried to maintain a positive relationship with the Trump administration.
Anything else, Josh, that jumps out from this, right now, the primary, since we're, before the primary, anything else that jumps out at you from this New Hampshire governor's primary on the Democratic side?
Well, I just think it's going to depend on who can, turn out the votes.
Yeah,
to say
it's
the
always
most
the case,
obvious
isn't it?
thing. But whether or not, Steve Marchand is right about where the energy of the party is going, and this sort of future-looking argument that this is a definitional election. The people supporting Molly Kelly see her as somebody who's very much in line with people who've been successful New Hampshire politicians in the past, and
sort of the Jean Shaheens and Maggie Hassan.
Yes, and whether or not Molly Kelly, is as substantial as they are, is an open question for Democratic voters to decide. But the next few weeks are going to be interesting.
All right. Well, the primary is September 11th. So, Josh Rogers, thank you very much for helping us out.
You're
Really
welcome,
appreciate
Laura.
it. NHPR senior political reporter Josh Rogers. Earlier in the hour, we spoke with Steve Marchand, Democratic candidate for governor. This is The Exchange on NHPR.